Hello, this is Professor White, and today I'll be teaching about photosynthesis. So this is a photosynthesis chemical equation. As you can see here, when you combine carbon dioxide and water, it'll yield carbohydrate, water, and oxygen. And if you do that 6 times to balance the equation, from balancing equation, you end up with 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water will yield C6H12O6, which is your glucose, and 6 oxygen molecules. Now, photosynthesis is a redox reaction, meaning there is an oxidation happening, which is a loss of electron, and a gain of electron in the reduction reaction. So let's take a look at this equation. So the reduction reaction in this process is when you break down your carbon dioxide. So it means there is a gain of electron to form your glucose, which is C6H12O6. But there's also an oxidation process happening when your water is broken down to release oxygen in the process. So let's take a look at the plant structure where photosynthesis happens. So chloroplast is actually an important ingredient in photosynthesis. And this can be found in the stroma, which is a double membrane, and it has what you call those thylakoid sacs or grana. And these thylakoid membrane contains the chlorophyll molecules. Now, this is important in the electron transport chain and the generation of ATP, wherein the hydrogen atom or H plus gradient build up within the thylakoid sac. Now, this is basically a rough diagram of what's happening during photosynthesis. So as the light hit thylakoid membrane in the stroma, that light reaction happening actually helps in generating the ATP or energy to drive the Calvin cycle later. And all of this happens in the stroma. Now, continuing on, which is your light reaction, like I mentioned, this is a light-dependent reaction, so it needs the sunlight in order for it to happen. And this is where energy is generated, okay? Now, the energy or solar energy is basically converted here into chemical energy. Now, since this converts the solar energy to chemical energy, of course, it needs ATP and NADPH in the process. And also, as soon as this light reaction happens, it drives in continuing on the Calvin cycle, wherein the Calvin cycle is basically still a light-dependent reaction, but this is where the sugar building is happening. So what it does is it uses the chemical energy, which is the ATP and NADPH, to reduce your carbon dioxide and synthesize C6H12O6, which is your glucose. Let's focus on to the electron transport chain, which are, of course, your light reaction. So this is kind of like in cellular respiration when you generate ATP or energy, because you can't really build something without energy. So what happens is the proteins in the organelle membrane is at work. Okay, so there are some electron acceptors, and that's your NADPH, and what we call a proton gradient across the inner membrane. Now, this is normally found in the double membrane. Basically, anything that has to do with energy generation, that's your mitochondria. And of course, the ATP synthase enzyme is involved in the electron transport chain. So again, we are trying to bank on energy in this reaction, okay? So here is the process of your electron transport chain. And in our virtual simulation lab, you should be able to get the feel of what is really happening during electron transport chain. So as you can see, the light hits the stroma, and then of course, there's a series of different chain that is happening in order for us to generate ATP and NADPH, which is needed in the Calvin cycle. So that's basically the summary of this process. Chloroplasts basically transform light energy into chemical energy, which is your ATP, kind of like a battery, okay? And the electron carrier, NADPH, is also there. So the ATP that Jack built. So once again, photosynthesis needs sunlight in order for your plants to generate ATP. In cellular respiration, you basically break down the sugar in order for you to generate the ATP. But let's take a look. Both basically moves electrons and runs the pump and pumps the proton and builds the gradient and drives the flow of protons to the ATP synthase and bonds the phosphate to ADP and generate ATP. So phosphate to ADP, so 2 P's, A becomes ATP. And that's basically how we kind of like pump that ATP. So this is another diagram of what is happening during the photosynthesis process in the stroma. So as you can see here, chlorophylls and other pigments are important in order for that light to be converted into chemical energy. And these pigments are embedded in the thylakoid membrane. It's right here. It's like, if you zoom that in, that's where it's at. And it is arranged in a photosystem. So let's take a look at what photosystem is in a bit, because these are a collection of molecules. Now, just a quick recall that the visible light is found in our electromagnetic spectrum, and it's like a very sliver of light that has a certain wavelength, that has a certain energy level, and it's very critical for your pigments to hit a certain amount of frequency or wavelength of light in order for it to work. So let's take a look at these different light in our spectrum. So photosynthesis gets energy by absorbing wavelengths of light. Chlorophyll A absorbs best in red and blue wavelength and least in green. Okay, so that visible light that's red and blue wavelengths, that is best absorbed by the plant. Okay, now some accessory pigments with different structure absorbs light of different wavelength, like chlorophyll B, carotenoids, and xanthophylls. As you can see here in this graph, there is actually a bit of a difference as to the absorption of light. And that mainly is the reason why your plants are green, because of those combination of chlorophyll that's found in the plant. Now let's take a look at photosystems. So there are two photosystems in the thylakoid membranes. Now, photons are usually the ones absorbed by these clusters of pigment molecules in the thylakoid. And when any molecules absorbs a photon, it is actually transmitted from molecule to molecule until it reaches a particular chlorophyll, which is, of course, the reaction center. Okay, so let's take a look at photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. So in photosystem 2, it's chlorophyll A that is involved. Okay, so in the reaction center, the primary electron acceptor removes an excited electron from the reaction center, which is your chlorophyll A, and this starts the light reaction process. So let's continue on. And normally this absorbs the wavelength red light in your visible light. And then the photosystem 1, this is involving chlorophyll B, and it absorbs also the wavelength of red light, but about 700 nanometers. So these are your antenna pigments right here in the reaction center. As soon as this got driven, those photosystems, electron transfer chain will now start working, and electron transfer chain uses light energy to produce ATP and NADPH. Then it'll go to the Calvin cycle to create your glucose. So basically, I keep on repeating that you need energy in order for you to produce the food of the plant, which is your glucose. Now, PS2 or photosystem 2 absorbs the light, and it excites those electrons, passes this from chlorophyll to the primary electron acceptor, and need to replace the electron in the chlorophyll, and therefore the enzyme extracts the electrons from water, which is of course a component in your chemical reaction in photosynthesis, and supplies them to the chlorophyll. And then splits the water right after that, and also combines with another oxygen to form oxygen. And that oxygen generated is basically just released out in the atmosphere, That's why we need oxygen from the plants. Now, this is another diagram of what's happening during the light reaction, which is a non-cyclic photophosphorylation. So one photosystem is not actually enough. You have to lift electrons in 2 stages to a higher energy level. It does work as it falls. So first, you produce ATP, but producing ATP is not enough. So second, you need to produce organic molecules for other uses, also needs to produce stable storage molecules for rainy days. So that's the reason why there's not a photosystem, PS1, that generates the reducing power as NADPH. And that's basically the non-cyclic photophosphorylation. Now, what about the cyclic photophosphorylation? So if PS1 can pass electron to NADP, then it cycles back to PS2 and makes more ATP, but no NADPH. It goes both ways, either cyclic or non-cyclic, whichever, as long as they're able to generate ATP. That's the most important thing we need to know. So it coordinates light reaction to Calvin cycle in this process, and the Calvin cycle uses more ATP than the NADPH in the cyclic photophosphorylation. It generates about 18 ATP and 12 NADPH to produce 1 C6H12O6, or your glucose. So let's just summarize what it means to be a plant. Now, plants need to produce all organic molecules necessary for its growth. So carbohydrates, lipids, protein, nucleic acids. It's very important, right? And we need to store chemical energy, which is in the form of ATP, produced from light reaction. And in order for it to do that, it has to be in a stable form, and that can be moved around plant. So our chemical equation here, our ingredients or reactants in photosynthesis is your carbon dioxide and water, plus the energy from the sun, or the light energy, to produce glucose and oxygen. And we also learned about light reaction, which converts solar energy to chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH. So what can we do now? Obviously, these ATP generated is needed to build stuff. And that is, of course, the process of photosynthesis. So how is that helpful? Well, of course, the goal of the plant is to make its own food, which is to make C6H12O6, which is your glucose. That's a synthesis process. Synthesizes to make. Of course, in order for you to build something, you need some raw materials available, which is your carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide is fixated, meaning there's a carbon fixation happening with the use of NADPH, which reduces your carbon dioxide to carbon and oxygen. And from carbon dioxide, to be able to produce sugar, it needs to be fully oxidized. And that's when the oxidation happened, that your carbon dioxide is able to be synthesized to produce C6H12O6, which has a lot of chemical energy in it. It's highly reduced. And by the way, this process is an endergonic process. So it means it's within, it's like synthesizing the carbon dioxide. So it put in a lot of energy. And as the reduction of carbon dioxide is happening, it proceeds in many small uphill steps. And each is catalyzed by specific enzymes and using stored energy in ATP and NADPH for it to be synthesized. Now, from light reactions to Calvin cycles, so the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, in the chloroplasts, and it needs products of light reaction to drive synthesis reaction, which is, of course, needed ATP and NADPH once again. And once this happens, the G3P, or glyceraldehyde 3P, is the end product of your Calvin cycle, and which is rich in 3-carbon sugar. So you also call that C3 photosynthesis. And this is an important intermediate in order for your glucose to be generated, as well as your lipids, fats, waxes, amino acids, and proteins, as well as your nucleic acid. Now, what is Rubisco? Rubisco is an enzyme that fixes carbon from the air, and it's called ribulose biphosphate carboxylase. And it is the most important enzyme in the world because it makes life out of air. So enzymes are also important to note whenever these processes happen. And very, very abundant enzyme. So let's just do a little accounting. So the accounting is basically complicated. 3 turns of Calvin cycle is 1 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And 3 carbon dioxide produces 1 G3P, which produces 3 carbons. And 6 turns of Calvin cycle will produce 1 glucose, or C6H12O6. And 6 carbon dioxide will generate 1 C6H12O6, which has 6 carbons, and you need 18 ATP and 12 NADPH to produce 1 glucose. And any ATP left over, of course, from the light reaction will be used elsewhere by the plant cell. And to summarize, photosynthesis, light reaction produce ATP and produce NADPH and consumes water and break down water, so oxygen can be released as a byproduct. And a Calvin cycle, this is when you consume carbon dioxide, produce G3P sugar, and regenerated ADP and regenerated NADP. And in the light reaction, as you can see over here, when sunlight hits our stroma, our stack of pancakes right here, okay, water drives the electron transport chain, produces ATP and NADPH, and as it produces these two, then it releases oxygen as a waste product, and after that, it's time to build sugar. So the sugar building reaction is your Calvin cycle right here, right? And as this happens, it uses that ATP and NADPH that was produced in the light reaction and recycles the ADP and NADP back to make more ATP and NADPH to be used by the cell elsewhere. And to put together, as you can see over here, the plant makes both energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, and it also makes sugar. So photosynthesis needs sunlight by plants to form glucose and release oxygen. And then that glucose is actually used in cellular respiration so that it breaks down that food to produce energy. And of course, as the cycle continues, that water and oxygen is basically needed to complete and do another cycle of photosynthesis. Now, on a global scale, photosynthesis is the most important process for the continuation of life on Earth. And each year, photosynthesis captures about 121 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and it synthesizes 160 billion tons of carbohydrates. And heterotrophs are dependent on plants as food source for fuel and raw materials. I hope it's clear of what the importance of photosynthesis is, and if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in class. Bye.